another session, an interesting session on Afghanistan. And today we will be looking at India-Afghanistan relations, past, present, and future. And we have our esteemed guest, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya. And before I introduce, I invite a faculty advisor of International Law and Policy Society, Dr. Suvrashri Panda, to really welcome him.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Subrasri, and I'm extremely privileged to welcome Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya sir on this forum. And we really want to understand how this current situation unfolds and how we could foresee the situation, how India could engage with Afghanistan. So over to Dhananjay sir.
Thank you, ma'am. So before before I move on, let me first introduce Mr. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya to everyone here. So Ambassador Mukhopadhaya is a retired Indian Foreign Service officer who had previously served as Indian ambassador to Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Syria. He had served for over 35 years in the Indian Foreign Service in various capacities in Indian embassies in Mexico, France, Cuba, and the Permanent Mission of India in New York. Notably, he was instrumental in reopening the Indian embassy in Kabul in November 2001 as charge d'affaires after the ouster of Taliban in Afghanistan, and returned there as India's ambassador to Afghanistan from July 2010 to May 2013. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya has also worked at the UN headquarters in New York as a consultant on social development and as a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Post-retirement, he has served as an advisor to the Niti Forum for the Northeast and head of a CII task force on Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. He is currently senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research, where he is focusing on Northeast India, Southeast Asia, and Afghanistan. Interestingly, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya's wife, Ms. Nengcha Lugum, was also in the Indian Foreign Service and had previously served as India's ambassador to Lebanon, Serbia, and Indonesia. So, and I also hear that Ambassador Mukhopadhaya is an ardent reader. He loves jazz music, and of course, he's traveled all across the world from Afghanistan to Europe, in a road trip, and then he has visited a lot of countries in Southeast Asia and Northeast India. So let me welcome you, sir, on behalf of my organizing committee, and it's a pleasure to host you here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Panda and Mr. Dhananjay, for this invitation on behalf of the IFPD and ILFS, I think it is, for this talk on Afghanistan. Really, it's a pleasure to be among sort of students who are interested in happenings in our region and the world. And although I'm not an academic and this subject is probably more suited to a historian than to a practicing diplomat, I will try my best to give you a sense of India-Afghanistan relations, past, present, and future. Remembering, of course, that as practitioners, we tend to look at all relationships from basically a kind of political angle. That's our job. We try to look for opportunities to preserve and to protect our best interests, our national interests, and to promote our relationships with our neighborhood and with friendly countries all around the world. I just want to add one little element to my biodata. I think you gave a very comprehensive bio for me, but I thought I should mention that I've also spent, I've completed the 41st National Defense College course. That was in 2001, and that I served 3 years in the Ministry of Defense during Mr. Fernandez and then Mr. Pranab Mukherjee's time. So I have a certain grounding in sort of defense areas as well. And it was in fact from the NDC that I was catapulted actually at 24 hours notice to reopen the Embassy of India in Kabul post-Taliban in November 2001. So, what I will try and do is really focus more on what I think is the current chapter of Afghanistan's relations with India and vice versa. which I really would like to sort of mark as beginning from the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. But before that, I'll do a quick sort of thumbnail sketch of Afghanistan's history, and particularly India-Afghanistan relations. As you know, Afghanistan had a long history, long before we come to the present period. In fact, it had a long history of relations with India, well before the pre-colonial period and even well before the pre-Islamic period. And if we go back to kind of ancient society, you will note that it was a place in which Buddhist influence from India spread very strongly into Central Asia and beyond, into into continental Asia, frankly all the way up to places like Bashkiria, through more or less the route that included Tibet and Central Asia. And edicts of Ashoka were found in present-day Afghanistan, close to Kandahar. Till today, there are a very large number of ruins that date back to the pre-Islamic period. And of course, the biggest and most formidable of those were the Buddha, the Buddha statues at Bamiyan, which until very recently did not suffer damage. And it was only around 2000, under the hands of the Taliban, that they were destroyed. And even after that, the Chinese actually took up a copper mine in Mesainak, in what is, I think, called Wardak province or Logar province, just south of Kabul. And very recently, they discovered old and actually precious and utterly beautiful ruins of a kind of Tibetan, Buddhist monastery there, preserved with wooden sculptures gilded in gold. And for a while, these were, in fact, exhibited at the National Museum of Kabul. You may know also that during the last period of Taliban rule, the National Museum was closed. A lot of the objects and artifacts at the National Museum were vandalized. But there were people in the National Museum who went out of the way to protect what they could protect. They buried some, they hid some, and they brought them out once the Taliban had escaped. Very likely some such process is still taking place. So anyway, the broad point I wanted to make was that in the olden days, there were no hard frontiers. Influences and the influence of states spread. They were very elastic. They spread depending upon the primacy of the political players of that time. I mentioned to you about the influence of Ashoka. This was not necessarily political, but yes, the Maurya dynasty had influences all the way up to there. There was always a tradition of trade and cultural and religious exchange and contact. These trade routes led up to places like Azerbaijan and the Caucasus on the one hand, and of course through Central Asia elsewhere on the other. Religious influences, much of this area that we talk about Afghanistan in pre-Islamic period, part of it had Hindu and Buddhist influences, but a lot of it had whatever influences were prior to the Zoroastrians. In other words, there are temples even today of communities that used to worship fire in places like Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan and places like that. And even in Kabul today, there's a mountain called the Ashmai mountain. So there are symbols of Hindu influence that survive. Of course, none of this is living anymore. Even the Bamiyan Buddhas, the relationship between Buddhism and India is something that is now in the past. You had the Kushans that held sway over a large area of those areas. Of course, then Islam entered Afghanistan sometime around the end of the first millennium, gradually took over. And then we started having, I think, the kind of military campaigns and religious fervor that caught on at that time. You had the Khiljis and the Tughlaqs and others who came and ruled India, eventually leading to the Lodhis and finally Babur. But broadly speaking, during this period, what I wanted to underline is that Afghanistan was not yet Afghanistan, a country as we know it, as a nation as we know it. It was really a territory, an area that was largely known as Khorasan. And it was essentially contested between the Iranians, the Persians, in this latest incarnation, the Safavids, and in Central Asia by the Central Asian dynasties, mostly of Turkic origin. Babur himself came from two branches of the Mongols and the Turks. And in fact, Babur was dispossessed of his kingdom. It was supposed to be a scion of the Chagatai dynasty. He was dispossessed of his kingdom. For the first 20, 30 years of his life, he basically fought to try and recover Samarkand, which was a really beautiful capital at that time. Finally, he didn't succeed. Eventually, he settled down in Kabul. And after ruling for a few years in Kabul, particularly when their resources tended to dry up. In those days, armies were not armies which had salaries and pensions like you have today, and perks and, housing. Essentially, soldiers were adventurers, men of fortune, who joined the armies of powerful people, and they earned their living out of loot and plunder. So loot and plunder was very much part of ruling in those days, except that in the Islamic period, this was usually joined with an element of religious conviction, religious fervor, so that very often it was given the terminology of jihad and so on. But in the period, in the medieval years, there were also Hindu kingdoms that were raiding and plundering many other parts of India at the same time. I just wanted to bring this out. Afghanistan became an independent kingdom only in the hands of what we know now as Ahmad Shah Durrani, or in India was known as Ahmad Shah Abdali, in the 18th century. And you all know that Ahmad Shah Abdali was a very active military campaigner and conqueror. He is reputed to have plundered Somnath. Later on, Mahmud Ghazni also raided India several times, basically for the wealth of India. The plains of India were always a great attraction for the hill people, for whom their economies were limited by the kind of land that they had. A lot of it was not arable land, whereas the plains of India were all arable, extremely rich, and the temples held fabled wealth, and so they were always a temptation for would-be for ambitious leaders and rulers of Central Asia and Afghanistan. So that was the context in which, let's say, even Babur arrived in India and started the Mughal dynasty. But Ahmad Shah Abdali, more or less for the first time, started what was called a kind of Pashtun dynasty. Towards Herat, you basically had Persian influence. I mentioned about the Safavids. In Balkh, and in that area, it was primarily Central Asian influence, Turkish influence, Turkic influence. And it was Ahmad Shah Durrani who consolidated the Pashtun areas, extended control over most of what is present-day Afghanistan, and brought about what is called Afghanistan now. And in the period between the early 18th century and the arrival of the British, the Pashtuns consolidated their hold over most of Afghanistan. Of course, the Pashtuns, their closest relationships were with the plains of India, simply because they were actually next door to the plains of India. And so they historically all through used to have relations with the neighboring areas, particularly Punjab and Kashmir. And a lot of this spread much further down. You all know the Grand Trunk Road, which was built by Sher Shah Suri. And, people talk a lot about the conquests, but the reality was that there was also a lot of trade. There was also a lot of travel. There were Pathans, as they were called, all over northern India, as late as about 30 years back, before the Soviet invasion, where they used to be settled as traders, as moneylenders, extending all the way up to Calcutta and even Assam. And, it was that background that Tagore wrote his Kabuliwala short story, because these pockets of Pathans used to be all over India, and they had actually very genial and good relations. Many of these people went into film. You have icons like Dilip Kumar, who were Pathans actually from the Pakistan side of the border, but Pathans, of course, straddle both sides of the border. And of course, much more recently, you have all the Khans, and you had Qadir Khan and so many other film stars who really drew their origin from the Pashtuns, or what we call Pathans. So that was the background in which, during the period during the 19th century, Ranjit Singh also expanded his territory to control Kabul. And in fact, the relationship with Kabul goes back much further. Babur Kabul was a suba of the Mughal Empire and lasted as a suba of the Mughal Empire until very recently. So the main point I want to say here is that though Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic, multilingual, a pluralist state, and as a kingdom, it is a new, as a nation, it's relatively new. It came about even as a civilization really only around the 18th century. But it was among the first countries in the subcontinent, in South Asia or extended South Asia, to achieve independence. And that was in 1917 during the World War under King Amanullah Khan, who was a continuation, of the Pashtun dynasties of the Duranis. In fact, after Durrani came Amir Abdul Rahman Khan. There was a lot of demographic movement. Pashtuns were resettled in other parts of Afghanistan that still today is having an influence in the rise of the Taliban. Pashtun pockets in different parts have contributed to the rise of the Taliban. And even though it was such a fractured country ethnically, even in terms of religion, they had both Shias and Sunnis. In terms of language, you had Pashtun, but the dominant language in the courts and in Kabul has been Farsi, a variety of Farsi spoken in Afghanistan that is called Dari. But the Persian linguistic and cultural influence in all of Afghanistan remains very strong. In spite of all this, these kinds of diversity, Afghanistan has not had a separatist movement. And you have separatist movements of all shades in various parts of South Asia, but not in Afghanistan. Even during the Taliban period, the Taliban controlled 90% of Afghanistan. In order to recover that last 10%, which was held by Ahmad Shah Massoud, they virtually lost the kingdom. And the attraction in particular of Kabul, whoever controlled Kabul, in a sense, was regarded to control Afghanistan. So as an early nation, of course, India had no formal state-to-state or government-to-government relations, because by that time, India came under the sway, other than Ranjit Singh, because India came under the sway of the British. And during this period, in the 19th century, the British fought 3 wars with the Afghan kings of that time, the Anglo-Afghan wars. And at the end of it, in 1893, they settled for what was called the Durand Line. The British were essentially reacting to other imperial influences coming in from the north and from the west. On the one side, you had the Germans who were trying to exert their influence and get control through Iraq, and they had even reached the Persian Empire. And they were sending envoys and emissaries and spies into Afghanistan to see what the British were up to. But on the northern side, it was the Tsars, the Tsarist Russia, that was simply also bearing down on Afghanistan. And as they say, they were looking for the warm water ports of the Indian Ocean to be able to have an outlet, an all-weather outlet for their trade. And the British were essentially competing with these contending forces. So they set up Afghanistan as a kind of buffer zone. And the Durand Line was never really conceived of as a boundary. It was conceived of as a line in which the British could extend their influence. In fact, actually, large parts of the Northwest Frontier Province within the Durand Line were not really administered or governed the way the British governed the rest of India. Just as it was in many parts of the northeast of India, the British drew the inner line and the outer line, but they didn't really govern or administer those territories. It was the same at the Durand Line. And on the other side of the Durand Line, really it was the Afghan kings who held sway. And their idea was that the area between the river Oxus and the Durand Line, effectively the river Indus, would be kept away from the Russians. So our relations were at that time, virtually non-existent. They were mediated. Though during the struggle for independence, several of our leaders used to take refuge in Afghanistan on their way. For example, Netaji stopped in Afghanistan on his way to Germany in order to try to, raise opposition to British rule in India. So that was roughly the background. Now, the 20th century was a relatively quiet period in Afghan history. From about the 1930s to 1970s, the ruler was King Zahir Shah. King Zahir Shah was not a very strong ruler, but he managed to keep the country together. And it was a period, I would say, on the whole, of relative peace and prosperity. Today, we talk about Afghanistan as the crossroads of Asia. But in those years, starting from the time of Amanullah Khan, when he achieved independence and tried to create a modern kingdom out of Afghanistan, I'll just remind you that Amanullah Khan was a king who, as early as the second decade of the 19th century, 20th century, sorry, actually tried to remove the idea of women wearing veils in Afghanistan. And there was this very famous occasion when he unveiled his wife, Queen Soraya, in public, which was considered extremely scandalous and bold at that time. And in many ways, a kind of conservative society like Afghanistan, and particularly amongst the Pashtuns, there was a strong reaction to that as well. But during Zahir Shah's time, for about 40 years, it was an area where both the Americans as well as the Russians or the Soviets at that time were contending for influence. Both were active. The Americans were had development projects. The Russians were very influential, both in development as well as on the political field, and so on. And of course, that laid the groundwork for the Soviet intervention of Afghanistan in 1979. But it was also an area that was open to travel. In 1977, when, as a student, like maybe some of you, I was 21 then. I took a flight to Kabul from Delhi, and then two friends of ours, one of who also joined the Foreign Service later. We traveled overland from India to initially to Turkey and then eventually to Europe and all the way back. There used to be caravans, virtually buses, lots and lots of buses of Europeans who were traveling from Europe all the way to India and Nepal as part of what was then called the Hippie Trail. And these people used to live very peaceably. You could see them in the bazaars of Kabul. There were no tensions. In neighboring Iran, there was a great deal of xenophobia, particularly towards the Europeans and the Americans, because the Shah's rule was extremely unpopular. But there was no such anti-foreigner feeling, anti-Indian feeling, anti-West feeling in Afghanistan during those times. And in fact, Afghan society was considered quite liberal. The reason I make this point is a lot of people think that, Afghans are ipso facto, because of its recent history, Islamic radicals or fundamentalists or extremists. And some people go to the extent of, conceiving of them as terrorists. It was not at all so. I mean, Afghanistan was a society which had Hindus, which had Sikhs that lived peacefully. It even had Jews until very recently, until actually the most recent Taliban takeover. There was one Jew still left in Afghanistan. And, they lived with respect. They were free to practice their religion. They were not persecuted in any way, except during the period of the Taliban between 96 and 2001. So this is the backdrop to which we come to the period of Soviet rule. Dhananjay, I take it that I can speak to about 5:45, and then you open for questions. I'm quite flexible. I can.
So we can talk. You can extend till 6, sir.
Okay. So now we come to the period of what we call contemporary history, starting with the Soviet intervention. Up to Zahir Shah period, Zahir Shah's rule ended in 1973 when he was deposed by his cousin Daud Khan, and Daud Khan declared himself president. And even during Daud Khan's presidency from 73 to 78, when he was ousted by the communists in Afghanistan, India-Afghanistan relations were exemplary. In fact, Afghanistan, in the context of Pakistan, Afghanistan went so far as to not recognize the creation of Pakistan when it happened in 1947. And it withheld its recognition of Pakistan in the UN until many years later, because they simply did not accept the Durand Line as the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So right from the beginning, Afghanistan's relations with Pakistan were very fraught and contentious. And the relations with India were an old and cultural relationship. I can't tell you that in those years, Indian classical musicians and Afghan classical musicians used to have a great deal of interaction. Musicians like Ali Akbar Khan used to spend months in the court of ex-King Zahir Shah. Ex-King Zahir Shah was in fact an avid lover of music. There are many Afghans who are still avid lovers of music, who draw their traditions of music also from classical rags of India. And there was one very recently into the 70s and 80s of the last century, Muhammad Hussain Sarahan, who was a top Afghan classical Indian music singer. He was also a great Afghan singer or in Farsi, and maybe also Pashto, which I'm not sure of. But he used to sing. He was of the Patiala Gharana. He used to sing with the greats of the greats of the 60s and 70s in India, in the mehfils of classical music in North India. So that was the closeness of the relationship. Again, Pakistan now acts as though somehow they have a natural relationship with Afghanistan and India doesn't. As far as Afghans are concerned, they think Pakistan is an upstart, this country that is just 70 years old. The historic relationship, which they value a lot, has been with India. And in the 70s, when I happened to pass through Kabul, a few of you may know that we used to have a military technical training team in Kabul. And it was not an issue. We fought 4 wars. India fought 4 wars with Pakistan. But the Pakistanis now make it out as though, Afghanistan could be a threat to India, or an Afghan-India pact could be a threat to Pakistan. But the reality is that we fought 4 wars and there was never any defense pact. There was never any, a kind of defense relationship that India and Afghanistan put together to threaten Pakistan. So these are all simply fabricated narratives, which a lot of people who have woken up to Afghanistan post the Soviet intervention, particularly in the West, people don't know. And a lot of people have ended up buying this kind of Pakistani narrative that, as Muslims, as Pashtuns who straddle both sides, they are the ones who have a natural, inheritance from history to have a logical relationship, natural relationship with Afghanistan. And India is somehow an interloper. In reality, it has been just the opposite. And so the kind of goodwill and all that had continued until the Soviet intervention. But with the Soviet intervention, when we went along with the communist regime and also with the Soviet intervention per se, was the first time when we were out of sync with Afghan popular opinion. And then from 1979 to 1989, while the Soviets were there, because of other geopolitical reasons, we were constrained and we supported. Remember, it was not just a Soviet intervention. Actually, they were invited by the PDPA, who were Afghans. And, the last of the PDPA leaders was Najibullah, who was a very strong Afghan ruler. And even after the Soviets left in 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed in 2 years by 1991. But Najibullah survived until 1992, in spite of the fact that the Soviet Union had collapsed. And in fact, perhaps if the Soviet Union had not collapsed and the Soviets had not withdrawn funding for the Afghan National Army, Najibullah may well have carried on for much longer. He himself was trying to reach out and with the Mujahideen and trying to bring out about a kind of peace agreement at that time. Anyway, the Geneva Accords took place in the 1980s. The Soviets withdrew. The Soviet Union collapsed. Najibullah collapsed. During this period, this was a period of Soviet intervention, that essentially the United States waged a covert war against the Soviets. And in that covert war, they were helped by Pakistan and by Saudi money coming in from the Gulf, who were trying to export Wahhabism away from Saudi Arabia towards other parts of the Islamic world. And this was, oil-rich Saudi Arabia under their monarch and monarchy at that time. So they reared what was called the 7-party alliance of the Mujahideen in Pakistan. Eventually, in 1992, the Mujahideen were able to take over Afghanistan. The Mujahideen were a disparate group. They had a number of factions, number of leaders. They included Ahmad Shah Massoud. They included Hekmatyar, who's still around. Massoud was killed in 2001. There were other factions led by Haqqani, this present Sirajuddin Haqqani's father, Jalaluddin Haqqani. There was somebody called Yunus Khalis. So there was Pir Gailani. There were a number of such leaders but the Mujahideen could not form a kind of unified and government. And the Mujahideen, of course, saw India as, again, completely out of sync. They were supported by Pakistan. They considered India to have betrayed Afghanistan at that time. And in any case, Afghanistan from 92 to 96 was not a stable Afghanistan, and it was not really possible to build relations with them effectively during that period. Finally, in 1996, starting from 1994, the Pakistanis began to raise the Taliban. Taliban really were raised from sort of orphans from the Afghan war who were living in the refugee camps of Afghanistan. They were recruited and they were formed into a kind of expeditionary force, a kind of religious militia who the Pakistanis then wanted to use to stabilize Afghanistan in order to be able to reach Central Asia for their trade and economic interests. And there is another angle to this, because for a long time, starting particularly from the 70s, Afghanistan, but even earlier when Pakistan was a member of CENTO, the Pakistanis had this desire, which continues till today, to reorient Afghanistan away from India and towards West Asia and Central Asia. So in the CENTO years, and there was something called the ECO, the Economic Cooperation Organization, they were trying to direct Afghanistan away towards Turkey. And they were trying to talk about these highways and railways that would link Istanbul to Karachi, and things like that. And more recently, they have started using the term geoeconomics, once again, basically to turn Afghanistan around and connect them with the Chinese in Central Asia, so that it is Chinese influence rather than Indian influence that prevails in Afghanistan. Of course, led by the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis think of themselves as the eyes and ears for the Chinese, and the Chinese provide the strategic heft and the economic muscle for that. So during the 1996-2000 period, essentially the Taliban came. Initially, they were just a religious militia. They were not a terrorist outfit. For 5 years, 6 years that they governed from 96 to 2001, there was zero development in Afghanistan. Kabul was virtually destroyed in the intra-Mujahideen fighting between 92 and 96. Though the Arab Gulf charities were there, though Pakistan was a very influential party in Afghanistan, and though the Taliban were in power without any great challenge for 6 years, there was not even the slightest element of reconstruction. In my view, actually, Pakistan had done this deliberately, because Pakistan wanted Afghanistan to be thrown back into the medieval ages so that they could control that area as a kind of ungoverned space and use it to raise radical extremists and even terrorist groups. And that several of the terrorist and militant groups that Pakistan raised against India, particularly over Kashmir, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen, some of them had camps in Afghanistan. And in one of the cruise missile attacks against Osama bin Laden that was done by the Americans in 2000-2001, in fact, many of the casualties were from an LET training camp in Afghanistan. So they governed there for those 6 years. At that time, given the relationship with Pakistan, we closed down our embassy and we left. And we returned only when, after 9/11, the Americans came there to ostensibly to eliminate Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. They didn't come there to really bomb Taliban out. But they were joined by the Northern Alliance that had been resisting the Taliban, whose leader was Ahmad Shah Massoud. And Ahmad Shah Massoud was killed literally 2-3 days before the 9/11 attacks. And in a way, it was considered a step towards their larger goal, because now Afghanistan would come totally under their sway. Only 3 countries recognized the Taliban at that time. Apart from Pakistan, it was Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But at that time, they were not a terrorist force. They really became a terrorist force after they were ousted from Kabul and went back into Pakistan. And then from Pakistan, they were radicalized by the ISI. They were radicalized in the madrasas. They were then recruited as terrorists. Then they started planting improvised explosive devices. Gradually, they were trained into suicide terrorism, suicide attacks using vehicles, and then eventually into much more complex attacks involving suicide attacks plus commando attacks. And for 20 years, they effectively conducted a kind of hybrid war in Afghanistan, in which they combined religious indoctrination, religious training of the mullahs, then sending the mullahs into Afghanistan, then getting embedded among the people and creating what they call shadow governance, a very sophisticated social media strategy, creating new narratives, and also creating a kind of fear psychosis amongst the Afghans. The calculated use of terrorism on everyday basis, attacking civilian institutions, as well as, of course, military camps, basically designed to wear down, to browbeat the Afghans into submission. So when the final capitulation took place, we should remember there was this long background of 20 years when the Afghans were literally hammered into submission. And then in the final stages, of course, they used political deception, diplomacy. They, in many ways, you could say they fooled the Americans. They backed the Taliban at the same time, while actually, pretending to support the Americans and getting paid for it as well. So they conducted this 20-year hybrid war, and that is the time they became into a terrorist force. So when finally the Taliban reoccupied Afghanistan, ending at August 15, it was really a military campaign with an Afghan face, but really with Pakistani mind and Pakistani hands behind them. And one thing I can tell you is that the Taliban had no organic presence in Afghanistan. There were Islamist parties. There have been Islamist parties, many of them supported by Pakistan, going back to the 60s and 70s. All the leaders that we see, the Mujahideen leaders were creations and part of that. But the Taliban per se, even now, has no organic presence in Afghanistan. They're 100% creation they are Afghans, but they're 100% creation of Pakistan. And part of Pakistan's intention behind this has been essentially to dilute their Afghan and their Pashtun identity and give them a much greater, an Islamic identity, which then becomes the Trojan horse for them to reach out all over Afghanistan and beyond Afghanistan into Central Asia. When the Taliban were finally defeated in 2001, was the first time, effectively starting from 79 to 2001, that means about 22 years, 22 years, that India had a chance to be able to get back into the good books of the Afghans. And of course, benefiting from the multinational and US cover and from the government of initially the Northern Alliance, then the Karzai government, and then of course the Ghani government, we built up our constituency in Afghanistan bit by bit, painstakingly, very smartly, I would say, because initially the West, which really was making the decisions for Afghanistan, was not interested in having a strong footprint of India, because they thought this would be a provocation for Pakistan, and they didn't want to annoy the Pakistanis. So we stepped in with a very low profile. We started, when I entered Afghanistan in 2001, I went there with a medical team and 5 tons of medicine. And we started our mission there, basically setting up small medical camps to be able to meet the medical needs of the Afghan people who for 6 years had no development, as I mentioned to you earlier. So we started with that. And gradually we started entering into some infrastructure projects. We brought electricity to Kabul through something called the Pule-Khumri Kabul transmission line. We created the Zaranj-Delaram road, which connected the southern province of Nimroz to the Iran border. And from there was meant to be connected much better to Chabahar. And then of course, we also started investing in Chabahar port. Similarly, we did the Afghan parliament. We did the Salma Dam. Now, Salma Dam has been a long Afghan aspiration. For 50 years, they've been wanting the Salma Dam constructed, but mainly because of Iranian opposition, it never happened. But we were, and it was in an insecure area, under great degree of difficulty. Indian engineers were able to construct and complete the Salma Dam. In due course, we developed a very strong education component to our relationship. By the end of this government, we were providing 1,000 scholarships to Afghan students. Besides that, there were many Afghan students who were studying in India on self-financing schemes. I'm sure many of you have friends in your universities who are Afghans who have come and studied here. There was medical, treatment for Afghans in India who didn't want to go to Pakistan or even to the Gulf. Perhaps that was more expensive, who used to come to India. And overall, an education relationship, a cultural relationship. Indian films were always very popular in Afghanistan. Sports relationship, we invested a lot in the Afghan cricket team. And this matter became a matter of great pride. You all know of Rashid Khan. And, many other great sort of Afghan cricketers who are there now. Essentially, we were seen as friends of the Afghan people. Now, effectively, what has happened is we developed this relationship. We created a good relationship with virtually all communities of Afghanistan. We were not seen as partisan to one group or the other. Some of the Northern Alliance used to feel a little disappointed that we have broad-based our relationship, and they felt that we had kind of forgotten them. But this thing was that we wanted a relationship with all Afghans. So all this proceeded actually very, very well. Trade relationship flourished. We started developing freight corridors. I mentioned to you about the Zaran-Dilaram road. Later on, we began to use that for trade as well. But there were 2-3 areas where we still fell short. And I'll sort of mention that because I think those are important. One is, I think, while we were wise in many ways in not meddling and not getting involved in Afghan internal politics, which can be very, very, risky, it's also true that in some ways we kept a little aloof from Afghan politics. So that when it came down to the crucial decisions facing Afghanistan, we did not really have political constituencies to who we had very strong kind of relationships with. Along with that, the Afghans had been reaching out to us for a much stronger military relationship. And I'll say that actually the Americans spent a lot of money on the Afghan National Defense Forces, but they did not really create an Afghan national army. The Americans entered Afghanistan for a counter-terrorism purpose, which was to defeat the Al-Qaeda. So they built up the Afghan army only in their own image as a counter-terrorism force. They did not develop a proper national army with a proper infantry or with artillery, with tanks, capable of actually defending their country. And again, the main reason for that was their dependence on Pakistan for their ground lines of communication. Pakistan more or less ensured that this would not be done. Americans also did not invest anything in their economy. Afghanistan is known to have huge mineral reserves. They didn't invest anything in the mineral reserves. Had they done that, Afghanistan would have earned royalties. They would have been able to stand on their own feet. They did not invest in developing a trade relationship. If they had developed a trade relationship, their most important market was India. But they could have also connected them to other common friends in the Gulf and Central Asia and many other places. But they didn't really greatly invest in trade either. We did, but we also did not invest in the economy in 2 sectors that India could have. One was the mineral sector. During my time, we tried to invest in the iron ore and the mineral sector, but that ran up against other problems. Basically, this was more or less timed with the US withdrawal. And so there was uncertainty in India whether such investments would be worth the while, whether it would be a sunken investment. But also investment in the livelihood sector. Like India, Afghanistan, 70 to 80% of the people live off the land in agriculture, horticulture, livestock. And there were many things that we could have done, barring the issue of security, which of course is something that we have to take into account. But I still believe that it was possible that we could have done more in terms of investment in Afghanistan, because these would have created, people-to-people business linkages. And they would have, again, contributed to the economy of Afghanistan. They would have raised the standards of living. They would have raised the, the confidence of people. And they would have been a much more normal country that could generate taxation and then stand on its own feet. Essentially, the Americans never did anything to help the Afghans stand on their own feet. And finally, in the military area, while we had a strategic partnership agreement and they wanted defense cooperation with us for various reasons, partly because the Americans would not countenance any other partnership other than NATO with Afghanistan, but also because we were not sure about the internal consensus within Afghanistan for a military relationship with India, and limitations, hardware limitations of our own. We were not able to really, develop our military relationship as much. So when August took place, and then, even in the peace and reconciliation talks, we were very careful that we did not want to undermine the Afghan government. Please remember that, a lot of people say when the whole world was talking to the Taliban, why couldn't India? The whole world was talking to the Taliban, whether it was the Russians or the Americans or the Iranians or the Europeans, for their own interests. Their interest at that time was to withdraw from Afghanistan. That is why they began to talk to the Taliban. They didn't do that out of any real sense of, trying to create a political consensus in Afghanistan. For us, we were very clear that we supported a peace process starting from 2010, but we did not want to support a peace process that was led by others, owned by others, and controlled by others. We wanted an Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled, and Afghan Afghan-led peace process, which President Karzai and Ghani tried several times. But Pakistan simply refused to allow the Taliban, and the Taliban could not, were also reluctant to open a line of negotiation with the Afghans of Afghanistan, because as far as they were concerned, they only wanted to talk to the Americans and get concessions from the Americans. But we were also very confident that as Pashtuns and as Afghans, even the Taliban would need us at some time. There was also the additional problem that the Taliban were not reachable to us. We could talk to ex-Taliban in Kabul, but once the Doha process began and the Americans sidelined the Afghan government, if we had also joined the bandwagon, then effectively that would have been a complete abandonment of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. And I'll tell you categorically that even today, the large majority of people would support a democratic Afghanistan, not a theocratic Taliban Afghanistan. In the last time, you saw how unpopular they were. You saw that when they took over, people were clutching onto aircraft to be able to leave. So they do not represent the will of the Afghan people. Right now, they are ruling Afghanistan purely by force and by deception. When looking at the future, a lot of people think that that the Taliban will provide stability for Afghanistan. I sincerely doubt it, because the fault lines in Afghanistan and the frictions within the Taliban and the frictions between the Taliban and the Pakistanis, the contest between the Taliban and the ISK in particular, the north-south fault lines, the Pashtun, non-Pashtun fault lines, the national resistance, the flag protests, the women protests, the kind of rights and democratic issues, all these will ensure that there will be no stability in Afghanistan. The Taliban will not be able to provide that. In fact, more likely, Afghanistan is likely to go the way of Iraq and Syria for a long time. This is not good news for us, because it means basically that together with the Taliban, there'll be half a dozen, more than half a dozen, maybe a dozen other extremist forces who have been fighting alongside the Taliban to regain control over Afghanistan, supported by Pakistan for the last 20 years. Their chapter, their ambitions will now come to the top. And Afghanistan effectively will be a staging ground for this kind of promotion of radicalism and extremism in Central Asia, towards South Asia, towards Iran. And you're already seeing the kind of sectarian attacks, the resumption of attacks against Shia mosques, which is very much part of their fundamentalist agenda. So the hope that the Taliban will change and become inclusive and accept Afghans who don't think like them and be able to form a united government, while we should do everything to support that possibility, I think the prospects of that are not very strong. So where does that leave us right now? It leaves us that we have many options. Of course, we have the option of supporting the Taliban, but if we were to do that, we have to count the costs that we would be betraying the constituency that helped us back in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021, and the people that we supported, the people that we helped educate, the democratic republic that we helped together with the international community support. We could do both. After all, Pakistan had relations with the Democratic Republic and still supported the Taliban and finally brought the Taliban back. We could have a relationship, dual relationship like that, have formal relations with the Taliban government, but continue to support the Democratic Republic. We could have a much more intelligence relationship with the Taliban as well. But I would say that India should not abandon its core constituency, which is a democratic constituency. The Afghans have been betrayed in three ways. First, their sovereignty has been betrayed for third country sponsored terrorism. Second, moderate Islam, which they represented, has been betrayed for theocratic violent Islam. And third, all the democratic values, the fundamental freedoms, the freedoms that we take for granted, individual freedoms and rights, that started off with the French Revolution, through the American War of Independence, 2 world wars, the colonial struggle, and India's own struggle for independence. All the values, the Afghans who are wanting to get out of Afghanistan today are fighting for those very values that modern civilization has been built on. And I think we have to take a call, whether we think that the Taliban are going to be a medium term or a permanent force, or whether these values of freedom will, one form or the other, come back. It's possible that this may be complicated by the kind of Iraq-Syria scenario that I pointed out to you. If it's an Iraq-Syria scenario, it's very difficult to have a strategy, very difficult to have a policy, because things will be changing every day, and only you can have a kind of contingent kind of tactic or a strategy or a policy for that. But the long-term relationship should be that even if we have to have a pragmatic relationship with the Taliban, whether it is for humanitarian aid, or it's for trade, or it's for medical treatment or continuing education, there is a lot that India can do to support the idea of a democratic. That means by virtue of continuing our scholarships, by allowing Afghans to travel to India, to get medical treatment to India, to set up in India, to set up civil society offices, women's movements, other civil society organizations, media houses can practice. As you know, media is suffering in Afghanistan. And up the road, it can host political leaders. It can create a platform for meetings of political leaders of Afghanistan who are now, scattered all over the world. If necessary, it can even support the resistance, as it did between 1996 and 2001, when we backed the Northern Alliance and Commander Massoud, depending upon the maturity of the resistance itself. So there is a range of options. India, for a lot of people who are defeatist and who think India is out of the game, I'll say that that's a very, that's a rather resigned attitude. India is too big a country, too important in the region to be out of the game. It's just a question of one's willingness to play the game and the risks that you're willing to take and the principles that you espouse. Because, you can have a completely opportunistic policy, but once you've betrayed, a constituency, it'll be very difficult to regain that confidence. I think so far India is, I would say, conducting a kind of pragmatic engagement. We have, announced 50,000 tons of wheat for Afghanistan, which means that for us, what is important is that we should keep our relationship with the Afghan people going through any or all these means that are possible. We should make a clear distinction between an illegitimate Taliban government that has come to power by force, backed by a third country, that has no internal legitimacy. And until it has internal legitimacy, we should withhold our kind of legitimization of them. Remember, India's giving legitimacy to the Taliban is a big thing. It's much more than China, or I would say even the United States, because historically, India has been really the most important country for Afghanistan in the region. So it's a big card that we have. It's not a poor card that we have. And it's only our ability and willingness to play, diplomacy and to play politics that will decide our future in Afghanistan. Sorry, I've spoken considerably longer than I think that you had indicated, but I hope you learned something from it, and I'll be happy to take questions. I can overshoot a little bit on the Q&A.
Thank you, sir. I mean, I should say that it was very informative, but it was more like insightful, I can say. And no worries, sir. I mean, even if you have taken a lot, bit of time, 15 minutes extra, it was a pleasure for me also to listen to you. It's a first-hand experience from a diplomat who has been in Afghanistan. But before we move on to question and answer, sir, I have two questions.
Sure.
One is with regard to your career, in the sense that when Osama bin Laden was killed in Abbottabad in 2011, you were, I believe, ambassador to Afghanistan.
Yes.
In Kabul. So, what was the political landscape around that time, sir? I mean, because Osama bin Laden was one of the main parties where the United States was searching for over a decade, and then they were successful. So that is one question. And the second question is, since you mentioned Doha peace process, I wanted to know, sir, from a diplomatic perspective, that we know that India was categorically avoided because there was China, there was Russia, there was Pakistan, but India was not part of the Doha peace process, it was again spearheaded by the United States. So, sir, was that a game? Is that a game changer for India's diplomatic interests in Afghanistan? because whatever we are facing right now is because we didn't constructively engage with them before, with Taliban as well. So do you think that was also, as you said, the bandwagon, we should have been part of that bandwagon? Of course, not, I can say abandoning our constituency of Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. These are my two questions, sir.
Yeah. So let me start off with the first, what did Al-Qaeda mean? Actually, Al-Qaeda did not mean much in Afghanistan. The real culprit of the war in Afghanistan was always Pakistan. When the Americans came, one of their big mistakes was that they defined the war in terms of counterterrorism, and within the counterterrorism, only Al-Qaeda. So they came in with a limited counterterrorism purpose, and then they diverted their attention. They decided that they needed regime change in Iraq. And then as a result of regime change, they got caught in a very long and very protracted counterinsurgency movement in Iraq. Then this counterterrorism mission was expanded to a counterinsurgency mission, learning the lessons from Iraq. And then after they did this, and this was around the time that this exactly what you are saying happened, the Bin Laden period, this was the time that Obama came into power. Now, it's very interesting that the Americans always knew that Pakistan was the core of the problem. But they were never able to, for various reasons that are difficult to explain, they were never able to pursue the logic of their own epiphanies, and they were never able to put anything into action. When President Bush sent Richard Armitage to Pakistan, to Pervez Musharraf, to get their support for the war on terror, Richard Armitage threatened Musharraf that he will blow Pakistan into the Stone Age unless they cooperated. Musharraf had no option, and they knew where the source of the problem was. When Obama was on his campaign trail, he famously described the war of Iraq as a war of necessity, of discretion, and the war in Afghanistan as a war of necessity. But he said in Afghanistan, the theater of the war is in Afghanistan, but the source of the war is in Pakistan. And that was the background in which he created the mandate of AFPAC and appointed Richard Holbrooke, who was considered a very forceful diplomat, to negotiate with Pakistan and the Afghans. But once again, they were misled. I would say they were misled by friends of the Pakistanis, in particular the British, that you cannot address the Afghan problem without bringing in Kashmir, without bringing in India, because Pakistan was effectively taking out its frustrations with India over Kashmir in Afghanistan, effectively legitimizing logically that you can have that a bilateral problem can be exported to a third country, and that too by the use of terrorism. So, but for some reason, even Obama failed to pursue that logic. Obama's, I think, their top military commander at that time famously said that the Haqqani Network was a veritable extension arm of the ISI. So they knew this, but they were not able to press that. The reasons for that we can go. I think one reason I just mentioned, but some people also bring the nuclear factor, the fact that Pakistan is very important. Once Biden told Ghani, or I think Karzai, maybe Ghani or Karzai, I don't exactly remember who, that Pakistan is 50 times more important than Afghanistan for the Americans. So given that kind of thought, even Trump, when he had his South Asia strategy of 2017, he nailed Pakistan. He said Pakistan is the problem and India is part of the solution. But in spite of all this, they were simply never able to take action against the Pakistanis. And I will say even today that there is no solution to the problem in Afghanistan if you only look at Afghanistan. The source of the problem is in Afghanistan. And if you don't bring Pakistan as the part of the, as some, what we call, in carrot and stick diplomacy, the West has only used carrots with the Pakistanis. They have not used sticks. And they have completely omitted the use of coercive diplomacy. And if they had to do this, they had to do this before. Because now with the backing of China and with China's rise and China virtually becoming challenging the United States at every point, even that has become difficult. So I would say Bin Laden was a red herring. And if they decided that they are there in Afghanistan, 20 years, trillions of dollars that they have spent to get rid of Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden. They have got rid of Bin Laden. They haven't yet got rid of Al-Qaeda. And at that time when they came, they had the support of the whole world. Even the Chinese, Russians, Iranians supported their entry into Afghanistan. I think they were too selfish. If they had entered Afghanistan, not looking at only their own interests, but also at the interests of the Russians, of the Chinese, of the Iranians, of India, the Central Asian republics, and had been able to form a much better coalition against the root causes of terrorism, which lay in kind of the extremism that was being promoted by Saudi Arabia and by Pakistan at that time, you might have had a much more different solution. And this also has a bearing on current politics. Today, all nations, and I would urge you also to think about it. Very often in India also, we think that, our national interests are only our selfish interests. America says America first. Russia says Russia first. China says China first. We say India first. Actually, it is the pursuit of a narrow nationalist policy that has landed the Americans into what they are there today. Today, I would say that you should look for mutual interest. I mean, you should always have looked for mutual interest and work together, because mutual interest is likely to work much better than narrow self-interest. On your second question on Doha, I know right now it's counterfactual. We are seeing what has happened, but this is a moment in time. In the Taliban ruled for 5 years, the rebound was 20 years. Only time will tell. Only time will tell if the Taliban are there to last. That it can be said that, all right, we missed a boat by negotiating with them. But we were very clear. While the Americans and others were negotiating because they wanted to leave, they were willing to negotiate with the Taliban directly and betray the Afghan government. And it's not just the Afghan government, because behind the Afghan government, and we have been criticized for being too loyal to Ghani. I think that criticism is valid. But essentially, it was not Ghani. We were supporting the Afghan constitution. And the constitution was a constitution of the Islamic Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. So we were supporting precisely those freedoms that are part of our own value system. And if you end up supporting a violent theocracy which has come to power by Taliban, you have to ask, what principles do you stand on? Can you support violent terrorism in Afghanistan and then refuse to talk to similar outfits in India? So it was never our interest to betray the democratic constituency. And therefore, we always said that it should be Afghan-led. If the Afghan people, if the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan Republic were to get together and come to an agreement, we would have been very happy to settle with it, because at least it would have kept Afghanistan united and together. Whereas we see that though the Afghan Taliban claimed to be nationalist, they preferred to make deals with the Americans, with the Russians, with the Iranians, with the Chinese, to attack the Afghan people. The only people that they have not spared are the Afghan people. So they're willing to do deals with the devil and with everyone else. But their real target was democracy in Afghanistan and a moderate Islam in Afghanistan. And I think we have to decide, you want to be part of extremist Islam or you want to be part of democratic moderate Islam? I think we took a principled position. Time will tell whether we made a mistake in that or not. But we did not. And, big mistake that we are making now is that we are not opening up visas out of security considerations for the Afghan people. But until then, we had supported the Afghan people and we got the political returns for that. Now, unfortunately, we are squandering it by a very restrictive visa policy, just when they need it most, when it's a question of life and death. So I would still say, and for all of you who are interested, please read 2 articles that I wrote in September 14, India Today, on what India can do in Afghanistan, what kind of relationship we can do. And I think something in CNN News 18, I did a thing on Pakistan's 20-year hybrid war. So these 2 angles, if anybody is interested, you can explore through those 2 articles. But there were a number of other articles that appeared between August 15 and September that you can search, because they are sort of more cogitated. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We'll now go for questions from participants. So we have quite a lot of questions here. So I request participants who have asked questions, if they can ask the question themselves, by switching on their video and audio.
Yeah. Dhananjay, what you could do in the interest of time is
Yes,
when somebody asks a question, you can just see if there are 2-3 questions around that question.
Correct,
we
sir.
can pack it together and yeah.
Yes, sir. That's what I'm doing. I think Adruti wants to go first. Yeah, Adruti, please.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. I mentioned I asked the question in the box itself, but I'll read it out. Seeing as to how Pakistan has such a stronghold over the Taliban, like you've mentioned, sir, and China has it on Pakistan, as it's evident, how can India direct its efforts into upholding its interests in Afghanistan without crossing paths with China? And on the same note, what's the influence of the recent Taliban takeover on China's string of pearls, and how can that impact India in the future? If you could elaborate on that, it would be great.
So shall I go with that?
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah. So, Pakistan's hold on the Taliban is something quite extraordinary and also not something very easy to explain. We know that the Taliban are chafing against Pakistani control. But so far, we have not seen a single statement by the Taliban against Pakistan or against the ISI. In fact, the other way around. They go around, they act as though they are very much beholden to them. In 2008, Mullah Baradar, who was the top negotiator this time and who's now a deputy prime minister, he was engaged in back channel talks with the Afghan government, with their intelligence, to come back to India, to come back to Afghanistan. The Pakistanis got wind of it, and they did a kind of sting operation in which they involved the Americans and captured him in a safe house in Karachi. And from then until 2018, when the Doha talks began, Baradar lived in Pakistani jails, and he was broken down physically and psychologically. But till today, we have not seen a whimper of protest from the Taliban about the treatment meted out to Mullah Baradar, and why he was released only for the negotiations with the Americans. Similarly, Mullah Umar was dead for 2 years before his death was disclosed, and they were disclosed by the Pakistanis. If the Taliban really had any autonomy, they should have been able to, make these decisions themselves. Even Mullah Haibatullah Akhundzada, who we hear about, is a reclusive figure. We don't know if he's a puppet or he's a real figure, whether he's just a face with somebody else manipulating the voice from behind, like a ventriloquist. So, and how is this possible? Of course, they say many things, and they say many things in very colorful language, which I can't repeat here. But the long and short is that by and large, they've been able to do this by keeping effective control of them and their families. At least this is what the theory that I've heard. So their control of the Taliban has been just total. Now that the Taliban are out, first they came out in Doha and now they are in Kabul, there is every likelihood that factions and elements of them, their disagreements and differences and their tensions and frictions with the ISI will start coming out in the open. And just like the Mujahideen, most of them turned against Pakistan, it's possible that many of the Mujahideen, the Taliban will also turn against Afghanistan. But Pakistan always ensures that it has one pet horse or more than one pet horse in the race all the time. So just as it had Hikmatyar amongst the Mujahideen, who continues to remain loyal to Pakistan, they have the Haqqani Network here. And the Haqqani Network is the most sound financially, the most organized, the most political of the Taliban factions. In fact, technically, it's not a Taliban faction. It's an old Mujahideen faction. But they have effectively conducted a partial takeover of the Taliban and pushed the Kandahari Taliban, which was the original core of the Taliban, into a kind of second place. So this is their control over the Taliban. In due course, the differences will surface. But for the time being, they remain trapped in that. China. So, this is a very interesting question. I know I apologize if it may take a little longer because you've asked a very substantive question that covers a lot of things. Presently China is led by a very I would say, a very bold leader, Xi Jinping. The Chinese system used to have various checks and balances. Over the last 4 or 5 years, Xi Jinping has eroded all those checks and balances. He has complete control of power. And in many ways, what the Americans have done is baffling. Americans have effectively withdrawn from a very strategic space at the weakest underbelly of China in Xinjiang, where there is a major problem with the Uyghurs. So for China, this is a tremendous opportunity to be able to fill that space, keep the Americans away, and not only fill that space, actually use that space to reach out to Iran, with whom they have a 400 billion, 25-year geo-economic agreement, to reach out to Iran and effectively become a player in the Gulf and Arab world, in West Asia, at a time when the Americans are actually trying to outsource their interests there to their loyal partners and focus on the Pacific. But secondly, I would say that so it enables them to connect with Iran and to become a player in West Asia. This is one. The second is, the Chinese are facing pressures in the Indo-Pacific, from the US, from the Quad, now most recently from the AUKUS. So in many ways, if they reach across the Central Asian massifs, the Central Asian mountains, the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush, the Kunlun, the Karakoram, and maybe you could see what is happening in Ladakh right now in relation to that. So in a way, it's an outlet from them. They can bypass the pressure that they face in the Indian Ocean, particularly in the Malaccas, and connect to their energy sources in the Gulf through Central Asia. So this is that. The third is the Pakistan factor. China then thinks that now, with the help of Pakistan, it can become a dominant influence in Afghanistan. But there is one problem. See, Pakistan has been promoting instability, destabilization as a part of its foreign policy, terrorism as part of its foreign policy. They also have a plan B, that if at all Afghanistan can be stabilized, they should be in partnership with China, so that effectively they are the winners both ways. But China has to face these 20-odd terrorist groups that I talked about earlier in Afghanistan. It cannot pick and choose the ETIM alone, because the ETIM also is part of that kind of fabric where they're all, in fact, interrelated to each other. So if it steps into Afghanistan and it tries to stop, just make a deal with the ETIM, it will still have to contend with all these other groups that promote radicalism, extremism, and terrorism. Then it runs the risk of getting stuck there in a Soviet-style bear trap, like the Soviets got stuck. And for all you know, that is the purpose of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, to lure China into this kind of bear trap, into this swamp. This is a kind of intelligence game that they are playing, possibly, right? So in the long run, Adruti, I'd like to suggest that there is a difference that, in the core interests of China and Pakistan. Pakistan has invested in instability. China needs stability in order to be able to promote its strategic interests, including BRI. And it was at that time that, we should keep, and remember, we have had a dialogue with the Chinese even before. We've had joint statements in BRICS. And in Wuhan, the one country that we were able to identify for possible cooperation was Afghanistan. We did some training for diplomats in China and India at that time. So I would say we should not assume that China may not have difficulties. If indeed the worst case scenario of a Syria-Iraq thing happens and these groups back the Uyghurs, then China's interests will start diverging from that of Pakistan. So, this is an open game. Nothing is closed. That's why I want to tell you, Dhananjay, something happened yesterday, something happened today. This is all movement in time. Look ahead and see, there always will be opportunities. And there is no such thing as the end of history. There is no such thing as the end of the great game. It's just a new chapter. There is no such thing as victory or loss. Sometimes somebody wins, sometimes somebody loses. It's just that you have to be in the game.
Sir, I think we will take 3 more questions if you are,
yeah, no problem.
So I think we have Siddhan Maju and Zafar Sadiq who are raising hands. Siddhan Maju, please go ahead. Please switch on your video if you can.
No problem. Mm. 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 Yeah, good question. Do you want me to take the second one as well?
Sure, sir. So that you can, sure, sir. Sure, so that you can, answer it together. So, Zafar Sadiq, if you have the question, you can state it right now.
Yeah, I mentioned the question in the Q&A box. So the question is, so in the phase between 1990s and 2000, when the Taliban was in the initial stage, I read it somewhere that Taliban was a kind of a reactionary force, which came against the tyrannical regime of the warlords who were competing with each other, who were fighting with each other. So it was said that the common Afghan people, the general Afghan populace, they preferred the Taliban rule over the warlords because between the two evils, uh, Taliban was a lesser evil whom they could choose and whom they could think that probably they could bring the stability and peace in the country. So, sir, my question is, how far of this claim is true?
So let me answer the second question first, then I'll come to the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. It was true when it happened. By 1996, the Afghan people were fed up of the intra-Mujahideen fighting, in which they were caught in the crossfires. So when the Taliban came, and their image was that of kind of religious, Talibs, religious students who were led by, a kind of pious religious teacher that was Mullah Umar, who was genuinely sort of respected at that stage. He was a mullah with one of the Mujahideen factions. How he was chosen, who chose it, I think I can leave you to guess. But the long and short of it was that initially they were seen as a stabilizing force. And, the Taliban were good at one thing, they were good at giving instant justice. And so, they were seen as a kind of stabilizing force that brought in some measure of justice compared to the Mujahideen, who by this time had been wreaking havoc in many parts of Afghanistan, and had turned also, some of them had turned predatory because, warlords with their guns can do anything. Until today, there's a strong sentiment against what they call warlords and so on. But this changed as soon as it happened, because people realized that, what they were in fact doing was promoting this extremely obscurantist, reactionary interpretation of the Shariat. Essentially, it was mullah rule. There was simply no development, no trade, no reconstruction, nothing. And as I said, I think it was Pakistan's plan to keep them in the medieval age, ideologically as well as economically, so that they had free play over that entire region. So in a year or two, in fact, the Taliban had lost their popularity, and the resistance continued. But they managed to continue to rule by force because the rest of the world had lost interest in Afghanistan. Once the Soviets were driven out, the West simply lost interest in Afghanistan and virtually handed it over to Pakistan. So the resistance against them never died. The resistance was led by people like Masood, but included many other of the, post-Taliban rulers that we saw over the last 20 years, whether it was Ata Noor or Ahmed Rashid, Abdul Rashid Dostam, or Ismail Khan in Herat. There were other people, charismatic people like this Abdul Razik, who was the governor of Kandahar when he was killed. He was the Achakzai Taliban. He was an Achakzai Pashtun, and he could have been a very formidable, force against the Taliban. But like Masood, he was therefore killed. Many other people who potentially could have resisted the Taliban were eliminated over the course of the last 10 years. So this is it. Right now, once again, they are ruling simply because the West has given up and they have the monopoly of the force. The first thing that they did once they came to Kabul and other places is they went raiding houses to confiscate all weaponry. So they have all the weapons, and and they've taken over. So that's how they are ruling right now. The TTP, the TTP, Afghan and the Pakistani TTP are really frankly joined at the hips. They are the same Pashtun people. They are the people just across the line. They are unified by the same ideology. Their ideology is exactly to, these people want Afghanistan in their interpretation of the Shariat, and the TTP wants Pakistan in their interpretation of Shariat. The difference is that Pakistan still has a sizable middle class and a sizable civil society and a sizable political class that is capable of resisting, at least socially, at the social level, capable of resisting the Taliban ideology. And it has an army, much stronger army. So all depends on which way they go. But even then, what is really very troubling is not only the TTP on the one side, but also the appearance of the TLP, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, who are actually a totally different dimension, because the TTP represent a kind of extremist, you can call it Deobandi, Wahhabi sector, whereas the TLP actually represents the opposite within that Sunni sphere of the Barelvis. And in the last 40 years, of course, you have seen that virtually all the Sufi shrines in Pakistan have been destroyed. So effectively, you have a pincer movement from the Deobandi side as well as from the Barelvi side that is reducing the moderate space. But having said that, Pakistan has still has a strong middle class and a strong also, you can call it a landed class. So I don't think it's going to be an Afghan story in Pakistan so easily. Though how the army and the government deals with it is something that personally I don't know much about. It's not my area, but I think we can all watch closely.
Thank you, sir, for answering both the questions. I think we have run out of time, and I think you're also not well. I mean, you were saying earlier that you were, so I don't want to keep you for long. And first of all, at the end of this session, I want to say, like, my personal this interaction, was really, really helpful for me, because I am always a student of international relations, and I always learn through these lectures. And today I learned some of the intricate matters that we as students, and we learn from career diplomat like you, because we have not been there in Kabul, or we have not been there in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or any of these areas, and you've been there and you have stated it very beautifully. I mean, with respect to the dynamics, the strategy, and the diplomacy that goes in between India and Afghanistan. And of course, over the years, I really thank you, sir, because you have executively stated from the historical aspects to the Cold War, and then the war on terror, and then the current day perspective. And I also had the opportunity to read your articles, sir, in the Indian Express earlier. About what I think it was titled what Kabul means for Delhi, or something on that lines, I believe.
I've forgotten, but I think it was the first one. It came out on August 16, actually, literally a day after.
What Kabul means to Delhi, or something like that. That was the topic, and I did enjoy that, sir. And it's after that I got to know about you more, and hence I approach you for this session.
You're most welcome. My pleasure to have talked to all of you.
Honestly speaking, it is a surreal moment for me, because I have seen you ever since this Afghanistan debacle. I have seen you in news channels and CNN News 18 and all these all these media houses, and I got the opportunity to host you. So it is my pleasure as well to host you. And
my compliments to you for organizing it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And I am looking forward to your session and to your other sessions wherever you are participating. And I know you're a busy man. You're saying you were embarking on a trip to Arunachal, and somehow all these got in between. But I personally would like to keep in touch with you in future as well. For we would really love to hear your thoughts on other areas. I mean, on Northeast India for that matter. And you've been in conflict areas from Syria to Afghanistan to Myanmar. So all of these things, these are hot topics in international relations, as you may know. So
I always enjoy talking to young people and to students, and especially interested students, and I'm happy to join you in yours.
Sure, sir. And our faculty advisor, for ILPS, Subrashri Panda, she was here, Unfortunately, she had to leave for webinar, and she conveys her regards that that she liked the lecture, and she has put that in the chat box as well. And I request all participants to please fill the feedback form and attend our next session on Friday. And until then, I wish all of you best of luck, and I wish Ambassador, I convey my best regards, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I thank you for attending today's session.
Thank you, and thank all those who've posted some compliments on the chat box, and it has been a pleasure talking to you. Goodbye.
Thank you, sir. Goodbye. Good night. Take care.
Okay, bye.